For your questions.
Do you think the Steele dossier included Russian disinformation?
Senator, that's not a question that I'm equipped to answer.
It was in the public news. It was you may have heard of it, the Mueller investigation. It was a $32 million investigation that went over a couple of years. Horowitz was an investigator general, and he looked at the FBI's activity in the beginning of this. And what the FBI concluded was that there were FBI agents throughout this period of time who concluded that, yes, the dossier was full of Russian disinformation. So let's say it is Russian disinformation. You say your new disinformation governance board is going to help the public with disinformation. You claim it's not going to be about domestic. It's going to be about foreigners and those evil Russians. So here's my question. The FBI concludes that the Steele dossier was full of Russian disinformation. CNN propagated this disinformation gladly for years and years. The difference, I guess, between your opinion and our opinion is that as despicable as it is that CNN propagated this disinformation, I wouldn't shut them down. I wouldn't lecture them. I wouldn't put it on a government website that CNN's wrong for propagating disinformation. The problem you have is you're not even willing to admit, we can't even have an agreement on what the FBI said was disinformation. How do you propose that you're going to have an office of disinformation governance if you see the problem in even determining what is disinformation?
Oh, Senator, because our work is not focused on disinformation writ large. Where we, the Department of Homeland Security, become involved is when there's a connectivity between disinformation and threats to the security of the homeland.
Well, that's what the Russians might be considered that. You mentioned the Russians the other day when you tried to pivot away from this being about censorship. But let's say it is the Russians. I know you're not going to ever agree that the Steele dossier, which y'all spent so much money on, was disinformation. But it was, and the FBI concluded. But let's just say there's an imaginary disinformation. You've discovered tomorrow Russian disinformation that's going to hurt our national security, and CNN's broadcasting it. What are you going to do?
Senator, let me...
You're going to tell Putin, you shouldn't do this.
Senator,
what are you going to do?
Senator, let me explain what we do in the Department of Homeland Security with respect to disinformation, and frankly, what we've been doing for nearly 10 years across different administrations. The cartels propagate disinformation that Title 42 does not apply to a particular community of migrants from a particular country.
How are they propagating this?
If I may, through social media. And what we do through U.S. Customs and Border Protection is actually communicate via social media and other channels that is false, that we do apply Title 42.
So let's say there's Russian disinformation as well. Are you going to take to social media and broadcast that people are broadcasting something incorrect about what you think is Russian disinformation?
Senator, let me emphasize...
Well, you said the other day Russians, and now you're saying not so much the Russians, you're saying the cartels.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not, Senator. You're mischaracterizing my statement.
Then what are you going to do if there's Russian disinformation? You're going to broadcast something on social media?
Allow me to share when we become involved in the Department of Homeland Security. We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the disinformation work that our department has done and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem. We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails, definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So
are not in pink.
do you think
Number
COVID
one.
do you think
And number
COVID do you think
two,
COVID
if I may,
do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
and number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've
that
got
we
no
should not
idea
take
what
action?
disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation. So I do have a question, and here's the question. So the Russians, maybe some cartels. What about COVID disinformation? Is that in your bailiwick for your disinformation governance board?
Senator, you would have to give me the details with
of Ms. Jankowicz. I have watched her with slack-jawed astonishment. Who picked her?
Senator Kennedy, it's nice to see you as well. The Department of Homeland Security selected Ms. Jankowicz.
Who at the department picked her?
Senator, we don't discuss our internal hiring processes, but I am the Secretary of Homeland Security, and ultimately I am responsible.
When the department picked her, did it know that she had said that Mr. Hunter Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation?
Senator, let me repeat myself and add one other fact. I was not aware of that. We do not discuss the internal hiring process. Ultimately, as the Secretary, I'm responsible for the decisions of the Department of Homeland Security.
When the department picked Ms. Jankowicz, did it know that she had vouched for the veracity of the Steele dossier?
Senator, let me repeat myself and add an additional fact. One, we do not discuss internal hiring processes. Two, I was not aware of that fact. Three, as the Secretary of Homeland Security, I am responsible for the decisions of the department. And four, it is my understanding that Ms. Jankowicz is a subject matter expert in the field in which she will be working on behalf of the department.
Yeah, I can tell. When the department picked her, was the department aware of her TikTok videos?
Senator,
They're really quite precocious.
Senator, I was not aware of those videos. I, as a secretary, am responsible for the decisions of the department. The department does not discuss its internal hiring processes.
Well, how will this DGB work? For example, when President Obama said, with respect to Obamacare, when he said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, is that something that the DGB will investigate?
Senator, the working group that we named the Disinformation Governance Board does not have operational authority and does not have operational capability. But there's a more fundamental principle that really strikes at the question that you have posed, and that is that our mission is to protect the security of the homeland, and we address disinformation when it threatens the security of the homeland. For example,
Okay. Let me interrupt you, Mr. Secretary, because I don't have much time. I'd like to hear that example, and perhaps we can talk privately. I want to continue probing how your DGB will work. When President Clinton was being investigated for having an affair with a White House intern, and he said, "I did not have sex with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky." Is that something the DGB would investigate?
Senator, again, let me be clear that the department's responsibility is to address disinformation that threatens the security of the homeland. And importantly, the working group was established because this disinformation work has been ongoing for nearly 10 years. The working group was established precisely to protect against the infringement on individuals' First Amendment rights, precisely to protect the right of privacy.
Can I ask you a couple of more before I run out of time? I think the chairman may let me go over a minute. I hope he does. Will the DGB be given its own police, its own enforcement powers?
Senator, as I have articulated, the working group does not have operational authority or capability. Its purpose is to make sure that the work that is underway in protecting the homeland, that has been executed for nearly 10 years, is done within guardrails according to policies and standards that ensure that that work does not infringe on people's fundamental First Amendment rights, right of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties.
Right. Yeah, the government's going to tell us what's true. What could possibly go wrong?
Quite,
Can I ask one last question?
Of course, and that is quite incorrect. That is quite incorrect.
Is the DGB going to accept referrals from the public where people can call in and say, "I think Senator so-and-so said something untrue, and I want you to subpoena him"?
Senator, it is so very important that I correct a misstatement that you made, that the Department of Homeland Security is going to be the truth police. That is the farthest thing from the truth. We protect the security of the homeland, and once again allow me to articulate what I have said previously, which is that the working group does not have operational capability and authority. It is to make sure that there are policies in place, standards in place to protect the very rights about which you inquire.
Mr. Chairman, this will be my last comment. Mr. Secretary, I meant what I said. It is nice to see you, and I do think you're a nice man. But I would call in as soon as you get back to the office, and I would ask that person who recommended Ms. Jankowicz to you, and I would fire him on the spot.
Senator Hyde-Smith.